There are some Chicago stories that were never meant to be told. Stories that happened in the shadows, away from the newspapers and the photographers. Stories about what happens when two men who've spent years trying to destroy each other find themselves in the same pew, heads bowed, mourning the same loss. This is one of those stories. A dramatized account of a November morning in 1942 when Al Capone and Eliot Ness attended the same funeral. Neither man planned it, neither man wanted it. But sometimes, life has other plans. Father Michael O'Malley had been tending souls on the south side of Chicago for 43 years. He'd baptized babies who grew up to be saints and sinners alike. He'd married young couples filled with hope, and he'd buried old men filled with regret. Father O'Malley didn't ask questions about where your money came from. He didn't care if you were a federal agent or a bootlegger. When you sat in his confessional, you were just another broken soul seeking forgiveness. When you knelt at his altar, you were just another child of God. Al Capone had known Father O'Malley since 1925. The priest had been there when May was sick. He'd blessed their home. He'd taught young Sonny his catechism. When the world saw Al Capone as a monster, Father O'Malley saw a man trying to provide for his family the only way he knew how. Eliot Ness had met Father O'Malley in 1930 during his investigation of a warehouse fire that had killed 3 children. The priest had been working with the families, helping them bury their dead. Ness had watched this elderly man comfort mothers who'd lost everything, and something about the priest's quiet strength had stayed with him. 2 different relationships, 2 different connections, but when Father O'Malley died of pneumonia on November 18, 1942, both men felt the loss deeply. Al Capone was 43 years old, but he looked older. The years at Alcatraz had taken their toll. The syphilis was eating away at his mind slowly, quietly. He'd been released from prison the year before, but he wasn't the same man who'd ruled Chicago in the 1920s. He was living quietly in Florida now, trying to spend what time he had left with his family. May took care of him. Sonny visited when he could. They had money, they had comfort, but Al had something else too: guilt and gratitude. When the telegram arrived telling him about Father O'Malley's death, Al sat in his study for 2 hours, just staring at the words. May found him there. "You're thinking about going," she said. It wasn't a question. Al nodded slowly. "He was there for us, May. When everything was falling apart, when the whole world was against us, he was there. Chicago isn't safe for you anymore, Al. You know that." Al looked up at his wife, this woman who'd stood by him through everything. Some things matter more than safe. May understood. She'd known this day would come eventually. The day when Al's conscience would call in a debt that couldn't be paid with money. "How long?" she asked. "Just for the funeral. In and out. Nobody will even know I was there." Eliot Ness was 39 years old, and his life had not gone the way he'd planned. After bringing down Al Capone, he'd expected to ride that success to bigger things. Instead, he'd found himself struggling with alcoholism, failed marriages, and a series of disappointing jobs that never quite lived up to the legend he'd helped create. He was working as a federal investigator in Cleveland when he heard about Father O'Malley's death. The news hit him harder than he'd expected. Father O'Malley had been more than just a source of information during the Capone investigation. He'd been a reminder that there was still goodness in the world, still people worth protecting. During those dark days when Ness felt like he was becoming as corrupt as the men he was chasing, conversations with Father O'Malley had kept him grounded. Ness's second wife, Eveline, found him packing a bag. "You don't have to go, Eliot. Send flowers." Ness folded a black suit carefully into his suitcase. "I was there when he helped bury those children from the warehouse fire. Do you remember what he told me?" Eveline shook her head. "He said, 'Mr. Ness, we honor the dead not with words but with presence. When someone you've loved dies, you show up, you bear witness. You remember.'" Ness closed the suitcase. "I'm going to remember him." St. Alphonsus Church had seen better days. The Depression had hit the South Side hard, and the church showed it. Paint peeled from the walls. The wooden pews were worn smooth by decades of worshipers. But on the morning of November 23, 1942, it was filled with people who'd come to say goodbye to Father O'Malley. Al Capone arrived first. He'd driven up from Florida with 2 bodyguards, but he'd left them in the car. This was something he needed to do alone. He'd gained weight since his prison days, and his hair was thinner now, graying at the temples. He wore a simple black suit and kept his head down as he walked into the church. He chose a pew in the back, on the right side, close enough to pay his respects, far enough away to avoid attention. A few people recognized him. How could they not? But they said nothing. This was a funeral, not a circus. 15 minutes later, Eliot Ness walked through the same doors. He was thinner than he'd been during his Chicago days. The stress of his recent failures had aged him. He'd cut his hair shorter, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Ness scanned the church, looking for a place to sit. That's when he saw him, Al Capone, sitting alone in a back pew, hands folded in his lap, staring at the altar. For a moment, Ness stood frozen in the doorway. His first instinct was to leave. This wasn't his place anymore. This wasn't his city. But then he remembered Father O'Malley's words about showing up, about bearing witness. Ness walked to the left side of the church and sat down, 3 pews ahead of Capone, close enough that each man knew the other was there, far enough away that it didn't feel like a confrontation. The Mass began. Father O'Malley's nephew, also a priest, conducted the service. He spoke about his uncle's dedication to the poor, his willingness to help anyone who asked, his belief that every soul was worth saving. Al Capone listened to every word. He thought about the times Father O'Malley had visited him in jail, before the federal trial. The priest had never once asked him to confess his crimes. He just talked about family, about faith, about the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. Eliot Ness found his mind wandering to a conversation he'd had with Father O'Malley in 1931. The priest had asked him why he'd become a federal agent. Ness had given the standard answer about justice and law and order. But Father O'Malley had pressed him. "No," the priest had said. "Why did you really become a federal agent?" And Ness had found himself saying something he'd never said out loud before. "Because I wanted to believe that good could win." Father O'Malley had smiled at that. "Mr. Ness, good doesn't win or lose. Good just endures. Good just keeps showing up." Now, sitting in this church, Ness understood what the priest had meant. When the service ended, the pallbearers carried Father O'Malley's casket toward the door. The congregation began to file out slowly, quietly, the way people do when they're not ready to let go of something sacred. Al Capone waited. He was in no hurry. He had nowhere else to be, no empire to run, no territories to protect. Those days were over. He was just a man saying goodbye to a friend. Eliot Ness also waited. He watched the families, the old parishioners, the people Father O'Malley had helped over the years. They all looked lost, like children who'd been told their father wasn't coming home. When the church was nearly empty, both men stood up at the same time. Capone from his pew on the right, Ness from his pew on the left. They found themselves walking toward the door together, separated by the center aisle but moving at the same pace. At the door, their paths converged. They stopped, 2 men who'd spent years as enemies, standing in the doorway of a church, neither sure what to say. Finally, Al Capone spoke. His voice was softer than Ness remembered, changed by illness and age and the weight of too many years. "He was a good man," Capone said. Ness nodded. He was. They stood there for another moment. Around them, Chicago continued its daily business. Cars honked. People hurried past on the sidewalk. The world moved on the way it always did, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in its midst. "I'm sorry for your loss," Ness said quietly. Capone looked at him with surprise, then understanding. "Yours too." They walked out of the church together, not as friends, but as 2 men who'd shared something important. At the bottom of the steps, they went their separate ways. Capone toward a black Buick, where his bodyguards were waiting. Ness toward a modest Ford parked down the street. Neither man looked back. Al Capone returned to Florida and never spoke publicly about attending the funeral. But May noticed that something had changed in her husband. He seemed more at peace, somehow. Less angry about the past, less bitter about how things had ended. 6 years later, when Al Capone died of a heart attack, Eliot Ness sent a simple wreath to the funeral. No card, no message, just white flowers and a recognition that death comes for all of us, regardless of which side of the law we've lived on. Eliot Ness would struggle with alcohol and financial problems for the rest of his life, but he never forgot what Father O'Malley had taught him about good enduring, about showing up. In his later years, he would volunteer with troubled youth in Cleveland, trying to be for them what the priest had been for him, a reminder that redemption was always possible. The story of Al Capone and Eliot Ness usually ends with a trial, a conviction, a victory of good over evil. But real life is more complicated than that. Real life is 2 aging men standing in a church doorway, realizing that they have more in common than they ever imagined. Both men had loved someone who was now gone. Both men had been shaped by their relationship with a priest who saw the humanity in everyone. Both men were learning what it meant to grow old in a world that had moved beyond them. In that moment, outside St. Alphonsus Church, they weren't the federal agent and the gangster. They were just 2 sons of Chicago paying their respects to a man who'd believed in the possibility of grace. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when no cameras are rolling, when no one is watching except God and our own conscience, when we choose to show up not because we have to, but because something larger than ourselves calls us to be present. Father O'Malley understood that. Al Capone learned it. Eliot Ness lived it. And on a cold November morning in 1942, in a small church on the south side of Chicago, three men's worth of wisdom came together in a moment of quiet understanding that lasted just long enough to remind us all what it means to be human. Before we end this story, I want to take a moment to explain why we tell these stories the way we do. There are countless tales about Al Capone, stories passed from one person to another, stories shaped by rumors, headlines, and exaggeration, stories that often turn real people into myths or monsters. On this channel, we try to do something different. We study Al Capone's life carefully. We separate legend from fact. We strip away the folklore and the gossip, and we focus on the human reality, the choices he made, the people he affected, and the lessons that remain. That does not mean excusing his crimes, and it does not mean romanticizing violence. It means understanding that history is rarely simple. Capone was responsible for terrible things. That truth never changes. But he was also a son, a husband, a father, a man who protected his family fiercely, and a man whose actions caused suffering far beyond his own home. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And when we understand that complexity, history becomes more than entertainment. It becomes a mirror. Many of the stories we tell here are the kind you might have heard growing up. Stories told by parents, uncles, neighbors, or old friends. Stories that began with the words, "You know, I once heard Chicago was full of those stories, so were New York, Cleveland, Miami." And if you lived through those decades or heard about them from those who did, you know that not everything written in books matched what people remembered. That's why your perspective matters. If you have heard stories about Al Capone from family members, neighbors, or people who lived in Chicago or Florida during those years, we would genuinely love to hear them. If there is a detail we missed, a story passed down in your family, or a moment you think deserves to be remembered, please share it in the comments. These stories don't belong to history books alone. They belong to the people who lived alongside them. If you appreciate stories told with care, stories that respect the past instead of sensationalizing it, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. Liking the video and leaving a comment may seem small, but it helps ensure these quieter, more thoughtful stories continue to be told. In our next video, we'll share another true story from the later years of Al Capone's life, one that takes place far from Chicago in a small diner in Florida. A story about a waitress, a cup of coffee, and how one of the most feared men in America became, for a brief moment, just another regular customer. That story is already waiting for you. Until then, thank you for spending this time with us, and thank you for remembering that history is not just about what people did, but about who they were and who they touched along the way. We'll see you in the next story.